Every single day, we're documenting our lives in this just relentless flood of digital light. But have you ever actually stopped to think about the technology that makes all of that possible? Behind every single photo you take, every video you watch, there's an invisible war being fought on tiny wafers of silicon, a war to build the digital eyes for our machines. This is the story of how one company pretty much won that war and how they built a truly invisible empire.
Just to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, check this out. Every single minute, we stream over 700,000 hours of video on just YouTube and Netflix. That's it. I mean, that is a cascade of pixels on a level humanity has never, ever seen before. And you gotta remember, every one of those pixels has to be captured first.
And that's where this invisible war is being fought. It's a microscopic battle to build what is arguably the most critical component in modern electronics, the image sensor. That's the little chip that connects our physical world to the digital one.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. This war, it's largely been won, and the winner isn't some flashy Silicon Valley startup, but a company you probably know for, PlayStations and headphones. In 2023, Sony controlled a mind-boggling 53% of the entire global image sensor market.
So how on earth did Sony pull this off? How did they build this invisible empire? Well, it all started with a classic tech showdown between two competing technologies. So in one corner you had the old guard, the CCD. Now, the best way to think of it is like an elegant bucket brigade. Each pixel collects light like a bucket collects rain, and then that charge gets passed down the line one bucket at a time to be counted at the end. Yeah, it was slow, it was a power hog, but man, the images were beautiful and clean. And in the other corner you had the new kid on the block, CMOS. Instead of that bucket brigade, CMOS was like having a dedicated little tap and an amplifier at every single bucket. This made it way cheaper, way faster, and like 100 times more power efficient. But the catch? The first images were pretty noisy and just not great quality.
And you have to understand, for decades, Sony was a CCD company, full stop. Their entire imaging empire, from that groundbreaking Mavica prototype to the legendary Handycam that just took over the world, it was all built on the incredible quality of CCD sensors. They were the undisputed kings of this technology. And then, they decided to tear it all down. This was a huge deal. In a move that absolutely stunned the industry, Sony decided to just abandon its throne and go all in on the technology that, honestly, a lot of people still saw as inferior. It was a bet-the-company kind of gamble.
And they didn't just dip their toes in the water. Oh no. Sony announced they were shutting down all their CCD production and sinking $1 billion, that's billion with a B, into massively expanding their CMOS sensor manufacturing. This wasn't just a pivot. This was an earthquake.
So why? Why make this insane bet? It's because Sony had this massive philosophical realization. They saw that the future wasn't just about capturing one perfect photo, which was the whole CCD philosophy. No, it was about creating a smart, integrated system. Because CMOS sensors could have logic circuits built right onto the same chip, the sensor itself could become intelligent. While everyone else saw a cheap component, Sony saw a platform for the future.
But okay, throwing $1 billion at a problem doesn't automatically win you a technology war. To make that bet pay off, Sony's engineers had to solve the fundamental flaws of CMOS, and they did it with a series of just brilliant breakthroughs.
The first big problem they had to tackle was that on the old CMOS sensors, the metal wiring was literally on top of everything, blocking the light. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Sony's solution was just brilliant and kind of radical. They figured out how to flip the entire silicon wafer over and move all that wiring to the back. This is called backside illumination, or BSI. And all of a sudden, the light had this perfectly clear path, which basically doubled the sensor's sensitivity and made a huge difference in low light. Okay, but BSI wasn't a final answer. You still had pixels and logic circuits fighting for real estate on the same tiny piece of silicon. Sony's next big idea was revolutionary. They basically said, why are we making them fight? Let's just stop. They developed the stacked sensor. They physically separated the pixel layer and a logic layer onto two completely different wafers, and then they bonded them together. This was a total game changer. Now, each layer could be perfectly optimized for its own job, with no compromises.
And this stacking technology, it unlocked stuff that honestly felt like science fiction at the time. Sony even added a third layer, a little slice of DRAM memory, which allowed for things like incredible 960 frames per second slow motion and silent electronic shutters that get rid of distortion. They had built a massive technological moat that their competitors are still struggling to cross today.
But having the best tech in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have a massive customer to sell it to. And Sony, well, they found the absolute perfect partner to create this unstoppable cycle of innovation and profit.
And that partner, as you've probably guessed, was Apple. For years, this was just a rumor, but then Apple CEO Tim Cook just came out and confirmed it, a decade-long partnership. And this collaboration started at the perfect time, right when Sony was perfecting these new BSI sensors and right when the smartphone camera was becoming the most important feature for pretty much everyone. This partnership created what you might call a virtuous cycle, but honestly, it was more like a death spiral for their competitors. Think about it. Apple needs the absolute best sensor for the new iPhone and pays top dollar for it. Sony gets this massive, predictable river of cash, which they immediately pour back into R&D and building new factories. This lets them build an even better sensor, which of course Apple buys for the next iPhone. And with every single turn of this flywheel, Sony's technological lead just got bigger and bigger.
And that flywheel is what cemented Sony's dominance. I mean, just look at these numbers. Their market share is often bigger than the next two guys, Samsung and OmniVision, put together. And while Samsung is a giant, of course, their resources are spread across memory, displays, everything. Sony's obsessive, laser-like focus on one thing, building the world's best image sensor, has kept them right on top.
But, being king of the hill is never easy. And Sony's dominant position also creates some pretty unique pressures and vulnerabilities, from conflicts inside the company to the shifting plates of global geopolitics. So there are two big risks to watch. First, Sony is also a camera company, right? So they tend to keep their absolute best, newest sensors for their own alpha cameras for a year or two before they sell them to competitors like Nikon or Canon. And you can imagine that creates some friction. But the second one is way, way bigger. Geopolitics. The entire advanced sensor supply chain, we're talking Japan, Taiwan, China, it's all concentrated in Asia. And that creates a massive vulnerability for the rest of the world.
And this isn't just some theory. The US-China tech tensions are actively reshaping this market right now. In an effort to build more resilient supply chains, Chinese phone makers like Huawei are now strategically choosing domestic sensor suppliers like OmniVision, even if the tech isn't quite as good yet. What this does is it creates a protected market, and it gives Sony's rivals the money and the scale to fund their own R&D and start closing that technology gap.
So, while that smartphone battle is still hot, Sony is already looking way beyond your pocket. They're aiming their digital eyes at the next great frontiers, the machines that are going to define our future.
The next massive battleground? It's your car. The market for automotive sensors is on track to more than double by 2030. This is all being driven by driver assistance systems and, of course, the big quest for full self-driving. Sony is positioning itself to be the eyes of every autonomous car out there.
And it's not just cars. They're going after the factory of the future, but with a really smart strategy. They're not just building one generic sensor. They're building super specialized sensors that solve very specific, very expensive problems. Need to get rid of motion blur on a super fast production line? There's a global shutter for that. Need to tell different kinds of plastic apart for recycling? There's an infrared sensor for that. Each one of these is a high-margin solution for a huge industrial need.
So when you put it all together, a risky billion-dollar bet, some truly brilliant engineering, and one killer partnership, that's how Sony methodically conquered the digital eye of the smartphone. They became the eyes of our phones. And that leaves us with one final, pretty crucial question. What happens when they become the eyes of everything else?